Everyone pictures medieval peasants as mud-caked, starving, and working from dawn till dusk under the thumb of a cruel lord. That image, while not entirely wrong, misses a crucial part of their daily reality, a part that might just shock you. These individuals, the peasant farmers and peasant women who toiled in the open fields and sustained the medieval villages, might have enjoyed as many as 150 non-working days a year. That number, 150 days, stands in stark contrast to the relentless drudgery we typically associate with medieval life. We imagine a world of ceaseless, backbreaking labor, where every waking moment was dedicated to scratching out a living. How could anyone, especially those living on the knife edge of survival, afford such a luxury? How could peasants possibly have leisure time when survival was so difficult? The very idea forces us to question our assumptions. What exactly constituted work and leisure in a pre-industrial agrarian society? Were these concepts even understood in the same way we define them today, with our strict 9-to-5 schedules and weekend breaks? This estimate, derived from historical records of mandated holidays, seasonal agricultural rhythms, and church observances, points to a dramatically different rhythm of life than the one we've inherited from the Industrial Revolution. This isn't to say life was easy for the peasant farmer, or to romanticize a period fraught with famine, disease, and the whims of a local lord. Those hardships were brutally real, but they didn't erase the possibility of significant periods of rest and communal activity. The medieval calendar, often dictated by the pervasive influence of the monk, was structured not by the ticking clock, but by the turning seasons and the unwavering rhythm of faith. To our modern ears, accustomed to the relentless grind of a 40-hour work week and the precious scarcity of paid vacation, the idea of a medieval peasant farmer having 150 non-working days sounds almost absurd, a historical impossibility. We're wired to think of work as a fixed block of time, measured by the clock, separated rigidly from designated leisure. Our 9-to-5, our weekend, our national holidays, these are the hard-won structures of industrial and post-industrial society. But applying that framework to a medieval village is like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The very terms work and leisure themselves take on a different resonance when you strip away the factory whistle and the office cubicle. What did work truly entail for a family whose survival hinged directly on the sun, the soil, and the beasts of burden? And what did leisure signify when there were no entertainment complexes, no global media, and often no artificial light after dusk? A peasant farmer's day didn't begin with a punch clock, nor did it end with a factory gate locking behind them. Their rhythm was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing demands of the open fields, and the solemn observance of the church calendar. It was a fluid, integrated experience, where tasks often blurred into social interaction, and communal celebrations were woven into the fabric of daily life, not just tacked on as an afterthought. This wasn't necessarily a gentler existence. The physical demands were immense, but the structure of time itself was fundamentally different, less constrained by constant, uniform exertion, and more by intermittent bursts of intense activity, interspersed with mandated or naturally occurring lulls. This is the fundamental tension we must grapple with. How does a society defined by a knife-edge existence, where famine was a constant specter, plague could decimate populations, and the whims of a local lord could mean ruin, also afford its peasant farmer and peasant woman up to 150 days free from labor? It feels like a contradiction too stark to reconcile. Our modern sensibilities naturally recoil, perhaps even scoff, at the idea of anything resembling leisure in such a brutal environment. And to be clear, this is not an attempt to romanticize medieval life, nor to downplay the immense, often agonizing hardships that defined it for the vast majority. No amount of holidays could erase the pain of a lost harvest, the grief of a child taken by disease, or the crushing burden of feudal dues. Yet historical records and agricultural patterns suggest these structured periods of rest, communal gatherings, and deeply embedded traditions were not just incidental but integral. The truth lies not in an absence of misery, but in a fundamentally different organization of time, one utterly foreign to our contemporary, industrialized mindset. This wasn't a matter of generosity from the powerful, but a systemic rhythm dictated by forces far older and more ingrained than any lord's decree. The answer, as we will now explore, is rooted in the very fabric of medieval society, woven into its calendar by the pervasive influence of the church, and dictated by the unyielding, seasonal rhythms of agricultural life. The monk in his quiet scriptorium and the peasant farmer, tilling the open fields, were both bound by a rhythm that commanded periods of intense work and mandated periods of pause. It's this intricate dance between spiritual observance and the demands of the earth that holds the key to understanding the medieval, lie the surprising truth of their hidden holidays. That explanation begins with the calendar itself, which for a medieval peasant farmer was not a secular grid marking weeks, but a sacred tapestry woven from faith. The church didn't just influence life, it was the structure of time. Every Sunday, for instance, was a legally mandated day of rest. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an ecclesiastical law, often enforced by the local lord through fines or even physical punishment for those who dared to plow or spin. These days were for worship, for community, and crucially for rest. Right there, you have 52 non-working days as a baseline, a full seventh of the year where the open fields fell silent and tools were laid down. But the Sundays were just the beginning. The medieval year was absolutely saturated with saints' days, holy days, and various religious festivals. Imagine a calendar where the commemoration of St. Michael, the Feast of the Assumption, or the 12 days of Christmas weren't just observances, but actual holidays where labor ceased. A monk in his scriptorium, meticulously copying texts, might have seen his own work interrupted by these holy days, just as much as the peasant farmer or peasant woman in the open fields. These were not minor affairs. They were deeply ingrained in the social fabric, often requiring attendance at church and followed by communal feasting and celebration in the medieval village. The cumulative effect of these days, beyond the Sundays, could add up to an additional 30 or even 40 mandated breaks from work throughout the year. This wasn't just time off in the modern sense. It was a complete cessation of daily toil, a forced pause in the relentless cycle of subsistence, dictated by a power far greater than any individual, the divine. Contrast this with our own clock-driven 5-day-a-week grind, where holidays are fixed, fewer, and often optional. For the medieval peasant farmer, the rhythm of work wasn't set by a factory whistle or a 9-to-5 schedule, but by the ringing of the church bell and the dictates of a holy calendar that commanded reverence, and with it, respite. Beyond the church calendar, the earth itself dictated another, equally powerful rhythm of work and rest for the peasant farmer and peasant woman. For much of the year, their lives were intimately tied to the cycles of the open fields. There were undeniably periods of truly intense, back-breaking labor. During spring planting, when every seed had to be painstakingly sown, or in late summer and early autumn for the harvest, work truly was from dawn till dusk. Entire families, young and old, toiled relentlessly to bring in the crops, knowing that their very survival depended on the success of these few critical weeks. These were times of incredible exertion, when the stereotype of constant toil feels entirely accurate. But these periods of intense labor were not constant. Agriculture in the medieval era, primitive as it was, also had significant lulls. Consider the deep winter months. With the ground frozen or snow-covered and daylight hours severely limited, large-scale fieldwork became impossible. While there was still work to be done tending to animals, repairing tools, mending clothes, or carving implements by firelight, it was generally less physically demanding and often more flexible. The relentless pressure of the planting or harvest season simply wasn't there. Similarly, between major tasks like plowing and sowing, or after one crop was in but before another was ready, there could be short, less strenuous periods. These natural ebbs and flows, dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land, created significant pockets of time when daily labor was far from the dawn-to-dusk grind we so often imagine. This wasn't a modern weekend, but it was a distinct slowing of pace, a breathing room intrinsic to the agricultural year. This wasn't a modern weekend, but it was a distinct slowing of pace, a breathing room intrinsic to the agricultural year. So, what did this leisure actually look like? It's crucial to understand that medieval leisure was rarely mere idleness. It wasn't about solitary hobbies or passive entertainment as we conceive it today. Instead, it was deeply communal and often tied to the very fabric of the medieval village, social and spiritual life. Imagine a festival scene. The village green alive with sound and movement, perhaps after a successful harvest or on the feast day of a patron saint. There would be feasting, certainly, with whatever humble provisions could be gathered: a roasted pig, plentiful bread and ale. There was storytelling, the passing down of local legends and family histories by firelight, and communal singing. Games, dances, and even simple theatrical performances were common. These were vital opportunities for social bonding, for cementing relationships, and for sharing a collective identity that transcended the daily grind of survival. Moreover, the very nature of work itself in a pre-industrial agrarian society often blurred the lines with social interaction. A peasant farmer and his neighbors didn't just work alongside each other in the open fields. They talked, they joked, they shared grievances and triumphs. Tasks like spinning wool or preparing food by a peasant woman might be done in a group, turning necessary labor into a social occasion. Building a new barn or repairing a mill involved the whole community, often culminating in a celebratory meal that felt like both work's end and a shared festivity. This wasn't the isolated, clock-bound labor of a modern factory or office, where social interaction is often secondary. Medieval labor, for all its hardship, was frequently a shared experience, integrated into the rhythms of family and community life. The division between work and not work was far more fluid than our contemporary, highly scheduled understanding allows. When the church bell chimed for a holy day, or when the season eased its grip on the open fields, the break wasn't just a cessation of physical toil. It was an invitation to participate in a different, but equally vital form of communal engagement, reinforcing the bonds that held the village together. So, when we consider the cumulative effect of 52 Sundays each year, combined with the often 50 or more designated saints' days and religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the Assumption of Mary, Michaelmas, and countless local observances, we already accumulate a significant number of mandated non-working days. Add to that the inevitable lulls in agricultural activity, particularly during the deep winter months when the open fields lay dormant, or the periods between sowing and harvest, when less intensive tasks permitted greater flexibility. These weren't necessarily weeks of complete idleness, but they were periods when the grueling, sun-up-to-sundown field labor ceased or significantly reduced. When you aggregate these diverse periods of communal celebration and reduced agricultural demand, the estimate of up to 150 non-working days a year begins to coalesce. This figure, of course, is an average, a historical approximation that would vary by region, by specific year, and by the dictates of a particular local lord or ecclesiastical authority. It's not a hard and fast, universally applied tally, but rather an indicator of a fundamentally different rhythm of life compared to the relentless, clock-driven schedules that would come to define the industrial age. It speaks to a pre-modern understanding of time, where the sacred and the cyclical rhythms of nature profoundly shaped human activity. But let us be absolutely clear. Presenting this estimate is not an attempt to romanticize medieval life. This re-evaluation of their leisure time does not erase the brutal realities that defined so much of the peasant farmer and peasant woman's existence. Famine remained a constant specter. Disease like the Black Death could wipe out entire populations, and the arbitrary cruelties and heavy demands of the local lord were ever present. Life expectancy was short, and comfort, as we understand, it was almost non-existent. These were not easy lives, and the periods of rest offered no guarantee against starvation or suffering. Yet these undeniable hardships, these moments of profound misery and injustice, did not mean work was ceaseless. They coexisted with a calendar that, surprisingly, built in significant pauses. The challenge, then, is to hold both truths in our minds simultaneously: the structured periods of rest and the ever-present shadow of immense hardship. It is this shadow we must now confront directly. The claim of 150 non-working days might feel audacious, even offensive, when we consider the sheer brutality of medieval life. And it is true, the daily existence for a peasant farmer was often relentlessly harsh. It would be a profound historical error to romanticize this era, or to pretend that the periods of rest somehow erased the overwhelming difficulties. We must confront the grim realities. Famine, for instance, was a constant specter. A bad harvest meant starvation for a significant portion of the medieval village. The Great Famine of the early 14th century wasn't just a tough year. It was a devastating multi-year catastrophe that claimed millions of lives across Europe. Then came the Black Death in the mid-14th century, a cataclysm that wiped out between a third and half of Europe's population. It devastated families, communities, and economies, leaving a permanent scar. Beyond these wide-scale disasters, warfare was endemic. Fields could be trampled, homes burned, and lives lost simply because rival local lords decided to squabble over a strip of land. A peasant farmer and his family were largely defenseless, caught between the demands of their own lord and the depredations of invading forces. On top of this, their lives were governed by often arbitrary feudal obligations, forced labor, crippling taxes, and severe restrictions on their personal freedoms. The monk in the monastery might have had his fixed calendar of devotion, but the peasant had the fixed calendar of endless rents and services. Indeed, life expectancy was shockingly low, often hovering in the low 30s. Child mortality was tragically high. A peasant woman faced immense risks in childbirth, and disease, even common ailments, could prove fatal without modern medicine. So, yes, when we look at the raw data of survival, the medieval period seems like an endless struggle against overwhelming odds. But here's where we must apply a crucial layer of nuance. While these threats were terrifying and, when they struck, utterly devastating, they were not the daily, hourly reality for every single person, every single day of the year. The shadow of famine was constant, yes, but actual starvation wasn't a year-round state for the entire population. The Black Death was a horrifying event, but it eventually passed, leaving behind a scarred but still functioning society. Even warfare, while endemic, ebbed and flowed, and didn't engulf every medieval village simultaneously or continuously. Amidst these profound vulnerabilities, the fundamental rhythms of life persisted. The sun still rose and set, the seasons still turned, and the religious calendar still dictated its periods of rest. Even the most tyrannical local lord could not command crops to grow in winter, nor could he abolish Sundays or saints' days without facing outright rebellion or religious condemnation. These mandated breaks, the lulls in agricultural intensity, and the communal festivities weren't luxuries. They were vital. They provided not just physical respite from back-breaking labor, but also essential opportunities for social bonding, for the retelling of stories, for the maintenance of a collective identity in the medieval village. These were moments of shared humanity, crucial for resilience in an otherwise harsh existence. The point, then, is not to suggest that medieval peasants were happy or content, as if their lives were some pastoral idyll. That would be a profound misreading of history and a disservice to their struggles. Instead, it's about understanding the structure of their time. It's about recognizing that even in an era of undeniable brutality and hardship, the calendar and the cycles of nature imposed a work-life balance that differed profoundly from the relentless, clock-driven grind that would emerge with the Industrial Revolution. So, when we return to that astonishing estimate up to 150 non-working days a year, we can see it not as a claim for an easy life, but for a life structured profoundly differently. This wasn't a world of modern comfort, but it was also demonstrably not a world of relentless, unbroken toil from cradle to grave. The medieval peasant, despite facing threats we can barely comprehend, still lived by a rhythm that incorporated significant periods of rest, celebration, and communal interaction. These breaks, whether mandated by the church or dictated by the seasons, were baked into the fabric of their existence. This reevaluation isn't about romanticizing the past. It's not about ignoring the hunger, the disease, the exploitation by the local lord, or the grinding poverty. To do so would be a profound disservice to the harsh realities faced by the peasant farmer and the peasant woman. Rather, it's about achieving a more complex, historically accurate understanding of daily human experience before the pervasive influence of industrialization. It challenges the simplistic, often grim caricature of medieval life and replaces it with a nuanced portrait that acknowledges both profound suffering and structured periods of respite. The medieval calendar, with its emphasis on holy days and seasonal lulls, offers a stark contrast to our own clock-driven, productivity-obsessed culture. It invites us to consider what work and leisure truly meant in a world where time wasn't strictly monetized, where community and faith structured daily life more profoundly than economic output. While their hardships were immense, the very prevalence of these structured non-working days forces us to re-examine our assumptions about incessant labor, even today. The medieval lie, then, wasn't just about their imagined misery, but about our own limited understanding of time and human endurance.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe for more stories like this one.